Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Learning Tree's monthly webinar series. Today, we're honored to have Jane Grohl, CEO of the DevOps Institute. She's joining us today to discuss SRE as a service management framework. Just a moment for some housekeeping. You are all muted as attendees. We will be able to see and hear Jane as she gives her presentation, and you can interact in the chat pod that should be to the left of your screen. So feel free to type any questions or comments. We welcome them all. After the presentation in the next week or two, you will have a copy of this presentation and slide deck available to you in your My Learning Tree account. With that, I would like to pass it over to Jane. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Grohl. I am a co-founder and current CEO of the DevOps Institute. I'm a former ITIL instructor. In fact, I ran a ITSM training company for many years, from the early days of ITIL through version 3, now version 4. I'm a former IT ops director, so I look at everything from an operations perspective. Specifically, I am a frequent speaker, and one of the things I'm the most proud of is I'm also the author of the Agile Service Management Guide, and really particularly happy today to be here with our partners, Learning Tree International, talking to you about SRE. If you're not familiar with DevOps Institute, our mission is to advance the human elements of DevOps. We're a professional member association, and we really want our members to have a safe and interactive environment where they can network with each other, they can gain knowledge, grow your careers, help your enterprise go through its transformation, and of course, celebrate professional achievements. We have 8 certifications around very specific DevOps topics, including SRE. I'll talk to you a little bit about that as an end. We don't do any direct training. We partner with organizations like Learning Tree International who can bring this type of knowledge to you and your organization. So go up to the DevOps Institute website, become a professional member. Today it's free. So I really hope you'll take advantage of some of the member benefits, particularly at our professional basic level. So this year, can you believe it's December 15th? Like, where did the year go? Some people say 2020 is 9 days long or 900 days long, depending on your perspective. But this has been a year like no other. And it's been a terrible human crisis. It's also been, the pandemic has been a global crisis for both individuals and for organizations. But as we start to emerge further into this new decade, one thing has become abundantly clear, and that's that digital transformation is no longer optional. Organizations that had already started building a digital footprint, that were able to survive online, really made it through this past year much better than those that perhaps had been a little slower to looking at moving to more of a digital footprint or a digital landscape, and perhaps were still completely on-prem or were talking about moving to the cloud. But digital transformation, as we go into whatever this new normal looks like, is no longer an option. But you can't be digital if you aren't reliable. And I think that's the basis of the interest in site reliability engineering, is we have to look at operations as a key piece of the agile DevOps operation continuum. Because again, digital transformation can survive if the organization can't demonstrate reliability and resilience. So if you're not familiar with SRE, I love this quote from Ben Trainer-Sloss of Google. SRE happens when a software engineer is tasked to design an operations function. Several years ago, several of the employees at Google got together to author the first site reliability engineering book, and then workbook, really sharing their experiences, some of the practices that emerged from their being able to manage their services at scale. Now, you're not Google, and we're going to look at this as if you're not Google, but there's a lot of guidance that came out of these publications that are really applicable to any size organization, but particularly to large organizations that maybe are coming from a heritage perspective. You can read these books for free on the Google website. They've been very generous. You can purchase them from Amazon or O'Reilly if you want the hard copy. But there's some really tangible guidance in here that is specific to service management. And I think as we go through today's presentation, hopefully you'll see a little bit more of that. So there are really kind of two sets of guiding principles around SRE. And so we're going to look at the first one from much more of a human perspective, and then we're going to look at the second set from a little bit of a technical perspective. Everything around SRE revolves around agreed service level objectives. Right? Objectives for the service. I really want to make sure that's pretty clear. Not SLAs, we'll talk a little bit about SLAs, but really agreeing on what is the availability, the capacity, the performance, the latency, the throughput of a service. And as long as the service level objectives are met, there's a lot of self-organization and autonomy that the site reliability engineer or the SRE teams can have. But if they're breached, there are also consequences. So I really want you to think about SLOs, not how you're going to respond in the event of an incident. Some people mistake that for SLA, but really looking at what is the objective of service levels for your services, and how do you come to some agreement on that. Once the SLOs are agreed to, then a key principle of SRE is that the team has to have the ability to regulate their own workload. This all started with Agile, right, where Scrum teams were given a set of tasks to accomplish, a backlog, and then within a period of time, a time box, they would complete that task. But how they did it, how they organized themselves, was really up to the team. Well, SRE carries that forward. The SRE teams have to have the ability to regulate their own workload, but they also have to have time to make tomorrow better than today. So in the SRE book, it does advocate that a site reliability engineer, a role, has about half of its time responding to reactive work and about half of the time spent either learning or engineering or looking at ways to make tomorrow better than today. And like many of these frameworks, whether it's Agile or DevOps or ITIL or others, we have to look at failure as an opportunity to improve. Nobody wants to fail. So you hear terms like fail mindfully, fail fast. Learn from failure is a term that's been trending very heavily this past year. Failure has to be an opportunity to improve, and improvement has to be a continuous effort. Now, if we go a little bit deeper into the guiding principles, you can see where we start to get a little bit more specific in terms of the actual work that a SRE would do. We have to be able to embrace risk. There's risk everywhere. Now, we want to have intelligent risk taking. We want to be able to, as I said before, fail mindfully, but we have to understand that risk is there, and that at some point you have to balance risk versus reward, right? What's the risk if we do something? What's the risk if we don't? And so embracing risk is a key principle. I mentioned about SLOs. You'll see in SRE that the service level objectives really drive everything else, right? It drives capacity, it drives incident, it drives change management. So really managing against well-defined service level objectives has to be the heartbeat that really drives site reliability engineering, but also drives operations forward. We have to be able to monitor distributed systems. Now, that's not a surprise to anyone that being able to monitor what's happening in production is a key piece of every operations team. Now we start to look at monitoring from a slightly different perspective. You might have heard the term observability, right? We're starting to see observability where we look at it from a reactive perspective, traditional event management, right? How are the components doing? Are we starting to reach thresholds? Have we breached a threshold? But really looking at the component level. In SRE, we also want to look at it at the external level. I'll elaborate a little bit more as we get forward. I'll save the center for last. In order to go faster, in order to be more consistent, in order to be able to meet those service level objectives, as we've seen in DevOps, now of course in SRE, we have to embrace automation. We've spent a lot of time in IT automating the rest of the world, automating society, automating our organizations, and now we have to automate ourselves. And we have to really embrace testing automation, deployment automation, application performance management applications. We have to really be able to look at ways to automate. But on the other hand, we also want to stay simple. Right? We don't want to be complex. We don't want to have heavy processes. Right? Everything about SRE is intended to get the job done, right, with kind of a minimum viable approach and a lot of self-organization. So we want to keep it simple and avoid the trend towards either complexity or bureaucracy. And so a lot of that's going to come down to release engineering. And while we're talking about operations from an SRE perspective, the role of the site reliability engineer, the site reliability engineering team, actually extends backwards and works very closely with the development teams, with the infrastructure teams, with the testing teams as well, so that what goes into production will be of a higher quality for sure. And in the middle, next to service level objectives, the key guiding principle of SRE is to eliminate toil. You know what toil is. It's that repetitive, boring, manual work that we all have to do, right, in order to get our jobs done. Well, a key guiding principle of site reliability engineering is to engineer your way out of toil. In the words of the continuous delivery book, let the computers do the boring, repetitive work so that we as humans can spend more time doing critical thinking and learning. So eliminating toil, whether it's through automation, whether it's through scripting, whether it's through simplicity, right, peeling away some of the complexities of processes or practice. But that has to be a primary objective. Right? We can't meet our service level objectives if we still have a lot of toil. Now, Google considers SRE its approach to service management. In fact, they call that out very clearly in one of the early chapters of the Site Reliability Engineering book. You may call it Systems Reliability Engineering, right? But they consider it its approach to service management. And again, those of you that may come from a traditional ITSM background like I do, if you look at the definition of the SRE team, you can see very classic, very traditional ITSM processes and practices built into their responsibility. They're responsible for availability, latency, performance, efficiency, change management, monitoring, emergency response, incident management, and capacity management. Those are ITSM processes, right? Today you might call them practices, right? But that is what ITSM traditionally does, regardless of what framework. And I want to be clear, I'm not going to compare SRE to ITIL. I don't think that's a fair comparison, right? I want you to think of SRE specifically as a service management practice on its own, right? Again, at the end we can talk about the alignment between the two, but I really want you to look at it on its own. The other thing that's really interesting about SRE, as I said before, is that the SRE team interacts with their environment not only post-production. So I come from operations. In a traditional operations environment, we would be standing by the wall waiting for something to get thrown over so that we can manage it in production. Well, SREs as a role and as a team actually interact with their product development teams, with their developers, with their testing teams, and with their users. So the role is very much embedded in the Scrum teams. Their role is very much engaged in DevOps. The role shadows others, and the role has individual capabilities to help make tomorrow better than today. It is an engineering mentality. And so again, like previous roles or previous responsibilities for operations, quality going in means quality once it's in production. And of course, the only thing that matters to your customer is that the service is reliable and therefore has high quality. To my mind, I told you I'm not going to compare SRE to ITIL, but it is significant that I come from the early days of ITIL. I was an old ITIL version 2 service manager back in 2005, so been a little bit of time, right? SRE to me is the most innovative approach to service management since the early days of ITIL, because there's tangible guidance, but there's also an adaptation to modern IT. And we're going to take a look at each of these practices again, I'll give you a taste. I can't go into a lot of detail here, but look at these. These are classic ITSM processes, right? Managing service levels, managing changes, right? Managing events or monitoring, managing capacity, managing incidents, and then of course finding the root cause for effective troubleshooting or problem management. SRE addresses all of these in perhaps a different way than you're familiar with, but these have to be managed if the services are going to be high quality. I mentioned this before, and I think it's significant for everyone listening to process, particularly if you do come from traditional service management. Self-organization or self-regulating systems really began with Agile, right? If you've read the Scrum Guide, you know that the Scrum Guide advocates that the Scrum team, is able to self-organize their work. They're able to produce whatever's going to come out of their sprint. But essentially they're allowed to have lightweight process, just enough process so that they could produce smaller increments of code that would later go downstream and hopefully enable a faster flow. Well, what came out of the Agile teams went into downstream activities that were still pretty heavy on toil, that were pretty manual. So now enter DevOps, where we looked at build, test, deploy, look at concepts like continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, and continuous testing. And again, a lot of automation built into the pipelines for DevOps, but essentially DevOps stops at deployment. All right, so continuous deployment, now go back and start again. And people like me would kind of stand and go, well, now what? Right, now that the code is in production or the service is there, how do we adapt to the faster pace of Agile or DevOps once we're in operations? Because that's really where value is created. And now enter SRE. SRE, by the way, did not grow up as a kind of an adjunct to DevOps. It actually grew up on its own from Google, but it is the third piece of this self-organizing faster flow of a software delivery system, right? Because again, all three of these are intended to be lightweight. All three of them are intended to go faster, and all three of them are intended to be fairly self-regulating with consequences, right? So again, if you're in an environment that has started Agile software development, you've stepped down into DevOps, from a service management perspective, SRE is a good match for that, because the SREs also work with the DevOps teams and the Agile teams as well. So really want you to think about that from a continuum or a value stream perspective. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is really give you a taste of SRE specific processes, or again, you may call them practices, and look at how SRE approaches that. We can't go very deep, obviously we don't have enough time, but my goal is to encourage you to want to learn more. So as I've said a couple of times now, everything in SRE is driven by service level objectives, not SLAs. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Not SLAs, service level objectives. And as I said before, service level objective is not how fast we're going to respond to an incident. That we've kind of groomed our industry to think that that's an SLA. It really isn't. Service level objective is availability, reliability, capacity, security, quality, performance, right? Really being able to look at those key indicators and ensure that the objectives for that service are being met, right? So they're high level. We manage to the SLOs, right? You either hit it or you didn't. And if you didn't, then there are steps that are taken, consequences that are imposed until the breach is resolved or recovered from. SLOs are measured by SLIs, service level indicators, and that may be component level, it may be application level, it may be infrastructure level, but those are the metrics that indicate whether the service level objectives are being met or can be met, right? So SLOs, SLIs, both are managed and measured. Now, SLAs, unfortunately, in my experience, what happened with SLAs is they became more legal than reality. So the goal was to get the SLA signed, right? The goal was to negotiate a service level agreement with your customer, however that you defined your customer. But the service levels really didn't become the focus point, right? The focal point was getting the agreement, not necessarily looking at what the service levels were. As I just said, sometimes even the definition of a service level was more of a, we'll be there in 2 hours, or we'll respond in 2 hours if there's a major incident. So taking it away from the legal side of it, right? And it's not even legal per se, but taking it away from that whole sign the document, it is an overloaded term. It takes on so many different meanings depending on so many different contexts that in service level management for SRE, the SLA is there, but it doesn't lead, right? It isn't the predominant goal of managing service level objectives. The goal is to define service level objectives, measure them through service level indicators, and again, drive everything else by the focus on achieving those SLOs. So it is a very, very different approach. Now, here's where SLOs really impact change management. So if we look at traditional ITSM, one of the challenges today that I see a lot is the disconnect between traditional change management and DevOps and Agile, where unfortunately traditional change management, whether you have a change advisory board or you have to put a request for change in a couple of weeks in the past, you have to remember that was awesome when we were looking at control and command and governance models. And today with digital transformation, the ability to go faster with changes, the ability to set thresholds when you might need to have more due diligence is certainly there. So in many cases, I get asked every time I speak or teach, how do we handle change management in a DevOps environment? Well, SRE takes a really different approach. And that's that a product team or a service has an agreed error budget. Now, the error budget is the difference between the 100% and whatever the error budget is allowed. And of course, it's mapped back to the service level objectives. But the interesting thing, frankly, the cool thing about error budgets is that the teams are allowed to spend the budget. Think of the term budget. You may have a personal budget, which allows you to spend X amount on X number of things, right? And if you exceed your budget, well, then you're out of money, and there are consequences that are associated with it. Well, the same thing here. The teams are given, the service is given an error budget. And as long as the collective team, the developers, infrastructure, DevOps, SRE, maintain the service levels and stay within their error budget, they can actually change at will. So lots of automation is brought into the mix, particularly testing automation, right? But this is part of self-organization. There is not a need in this case to be able to have some kind of enterprise board approve changes. Now, of course, there are thresholds, all right? There are still thresholds where if the impact is so great, maybe the definition of the error budget changes, but the team is given the ability, the autonomy to make changes and to be accountable for the results, which means that, again, the automation has to be consistent, the amount of toil or human intervention has to be less. But the net result is you'll be able to increase your release velocity because some of the inherent delays are not there, right? You might think of this as more standard changes or a different definition of a standard change, but again, the budget is meant to be spent. It's very clear from Google. And so if we take away some of the human intervention, right, we minimize the number of users and operations that are exposed to bad changes because there's so much good testing and there's so much consistency, then we also avoid some of the cynicism, we avoid some of the fatigue, we certainly remove the contempt, and then also highly repetitive tasks, toil, get removed because, again, there's so much testing going on that the ability to release at will becomes greater. So I really want you, if you're stuck on change management, right, that's the crossroads between DevOps, ITIL, SRE, Agile. This is something to experiment with. You may not be comfortable going completely into an error budget model at the beginning, but hopefully it's something that you can experiment with. Maybe a single service can adapt to trying error budgets. But I mentioned about event management before, monitoring, which still has a role in reliability, resilience, right? You're going to hear a lot more about observability, and I'll explain that in a minute, but SRE does provide some pretty tangible guidance on event management, monitoring, really looking at monitoring from multiple perspectives. Certainly at the component level, monitoring is much more reactive to what's happening in the environment, looking at latency, traffic, errors, saturation. But enter observability, where developers now are observing the environment both internally and externally, right? So it's no longer just an operational task. In my day, there'd be a bunch of people sitting in the data center, looking at screens for red, red, amber, and green. Now it allows developers who own their code to be able to observe what's happening with their code in production from both an internal and an external perspective. So if you are at all involved in event management, do a little bit of research on observability. It is trending very, very quickly as kind of a new approach to being able to manage events. It does not replace monitoring. Monitoring is still a key piece of it from a component and a reactive level. But again, SRE really kind of embraces this as very, very important. And of course now, again, getting our developers engaged is kind of moving forward, very progressive. Capacity management. This is an area of SRE that I'm particularly excited about because coming from traditional ITSM, while we always had a capacity management process from the early days of version 2 ITIL, the accountability for capacity was a little bit less clear. Right? Who owned capacity? Where was the capacity plan going to be built? Well, in SRE, it's very clear. SRE teams are in charge of capacity planning and provisioning. They look at organic growth, so just kind of natural usage. They also look at event-driven growth. So again, we're in the holiday season. Many organizations may be seeing a lot more traffic, and so capacity has to be managed that way. We need to be able to forecast and predict. You may be hearing the terms elastic, particularly in cloud infrastructure, the ability to expand or compress based on activity. But more than that, capacity management and performance management is the responsibility of the site reliability engineer and the SRE teams. So it really does put it someplace in individuals and teams that have the best view of what's happening with capacity, and also because they interact, I think, with other teams like developers and infrastructure, the forecast can likely be more realistic, or at least more on target. So very excited that capacity management actually found a home in SRE and in this very specific role in team. And then incident management. So I come from the service desk. My first foray into IT was actually managing service desk, and so I've been involved in incident management for a long time. SRE takes a little bit of a different approach to SRE, which is a bit of a get it done. In incident management, by the way, a lot of focus on incident management between DevOps, SRE, even looking at developers and learning from failure, right? Because that's a theme that carries through so many of these frameworks. But in incident management, from an SRE perspective, it really depends, of course, on the scope and impact of the incident, but SRE advocates that an incident command system is established. And so depending, again, on the service that's affected, depending on the impact of the incident, SRE also advocates that an incident commander is assigned, right? A central point of accountability for that incident, as opposed to, you know, kind of who, what, when, wow, and a lot of the activity that's involved in incident management is often trying to find the right people, find the resources, trying to figure out what changed. In this case, by assigning an incident commander for each service and then an incident command system. Now, system doesn't necessarily mean technology, but some type of a clear process that's associated with it. The command is the one that structures the response, assigns who's going to do what, and removes the roadblocks, right? And then also keeps what's known as a living incident document. So again, it could be a document, it could be a ticket in an ITSM system, but there is a living document that is available to everyone that is affected or involved in the incident, which may later be replicated in a ticketing system for historical purpose, or may be captured in a ticketing system or an ITSM tool. But most importantly, in incident management, the goal is not to waste time trying to figure out who to escalate it to, making sure, you know, sometimes it goes to the wrong resources, sometimes there's a delay in their picking it up. So having a command system where there's, you know, you might hear the term swarming, particularly in incidents that have a significant impact, you want to make sure there's a really clear live handoff so that that incident can be restored as quickly as possible. Now, problem management, in SRE known as effective troubleshooting, is a process that I often think has been very misunderstood from the early days of ITSM, because incidents don't grow up to be problems, right? Incidents are indicators that a problem exists, that an underlying problem exists. So the SRE book really does call out techniques and opportunities for what's known as effective troubleshooting, which is creating a problem report. We've had X number of incidents or one incident that's been significant. How to triage it, how to really examine it, how to diagnose it, right? It's almost like a medical condition. And then being able to test whether the hypothesis is true, and then treat it and cure it. And if it's not true, moving on to the next potential root cause, very much like the scientific method, right? Where we identify a problem, we kind of triage it based on priority, and then step by step we go through trying to either prove that that's the root cause or disproving that it's the root cause. More importantly, SRE, among others, focuses on what's known as a blameless postmortem, right? It is a big part of SRE culture, and like DevOps, SRE is as much a cultural movement as it is a technical or role-based movement. We have to be comfortable with blameless postmortems. We have to move away from indictment, right? Or follow the pointing finger because it couldn't be me, it has to be you. So really starting to look at, being able to identify root cause and removing the blame. And again, from a cultural perspective, because SRE does develop relationships with other teams, with multiple service owners or product owners, with developers, hopefully the ability to conduct a blameless postmortem gets easier, right? Gets easier. But again, there is a cultural shift that's associated with that isn't just looking at the steps for problem management, but being able to, move forward more collaboratively. So those are kind of key ITSM processes or practices, and I hope the little taste that I gave you shows you that from a site reliability engineering perspective, these are areas that have to be managed, right? If we're going to have quality services, these are going to have to be be managed. But there's other areas that need to be managed as well. SREs as a role are often the on-call people. You might have thought of them as second or third level of support, and they have independent capabilities, skills, hopefully to be able to resolve some of the emergencies that they get called upon. And if you listen to SREs speak at conferences and others, you'll hear them talk a lot about what it's like to be on call and how to avoid waking people up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And again, they have a lot of independent capability and access to be able to do that. Load balancing, right? That's part of capacity and being able to manage load balancing. There's nothing we do today that doesn't have an impact on security. And so really understanding, security pre-production, security testing, certainly security incidents, and just managing security from an operational perspective. I'm going to save software engineering for just a minute. Managing operational loads, right? So again, going back to load balancing, being good communicators and collaborators. As I said, SRE is as much a cultural movement as it is a technical movement. And a lot of that is the ability to communicate well, particularly if there's an incident or there's something that another team needs to get involved in, making sure the communication is on target, that the message is right for the audience, and then being a good collaborator with other teams, part of that blameless, but also part of that curiosity. SREs by their nature are very curious roles. And then, reliable product launches. Everything in DevOps takes you up to deployment, but the true test of value creation is once the product or the service goes into production and is in use by the customers. And then let's just stop and look at software engineering. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about ITSM, SRE, and is it too technical a role? Everything in SRE is about maintaining an engineering mentality. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a deep technologist, full stack developer, or anything like that. But you have to have an engineering mentality. You have to think in terms of architectures. Even process architectures are engineering, right? We're engineering our process architectures to be effective and to be efficient. But at the end of the day, what we're really looking at here is software delivery. So engineering so that we're optimizing automation, we're building scripts, we're making our lives better tomorrow than today. And so there is a software engineering mentality here, but even before that, if you're a traditional ITSM, you have to start thinking about engineering service management to match the engineering for the delivery of either external software that's going to go through the process or internal software that's going to help with automating some of this toil. So the key question that I hear from a lot of folks in the ITSM space about SRE is, isn't it just a techie role? Now, frankly, I'm the least technical person on the block, right? I'm not a coder by trade, but I figured if little kids can learn Python, I probably could too. Now with low code, no code, the ability to build scripts and to really do more from those that are not necessarily software engineers is there. But let's face facts. We are information technology, right? So we should not shy away from practices that, look to optimize automation for ourselves, that look to be able to reduce toil. We are IT. And so by our nature, we are all technologists. So again, don't kind of step away from SRE because you feel that it's much more of a technical discipline. It is an engineering discipline. And as I said before, in order to be good engineers, we have to have a durable focus on engineering. The other thing is automation in and of itself is inefficient if it isn't accompanied by intelligent process. Right? We need intelligent process for intelligent automation, and all of the service management processes or practices are designed to underpin the delivery and the sustainability of quality services. So there does have to be a durable focus on engineering. There does have to be a focus on reducing toil. And those roles that are doing the toil, let's repurpose them and do what only humans do really well, at least today, which is critical thinking. And we do need to allocate time for these individuals to learn new skills. And so that's the 50% reactive, 50% proactive. SRE is on the rise. DevOps Institute does an annual report known as the Upskilling Report. The survey is open now, so I would encourage you to complete the survey for the 2021 report. But from 2019 to 2020, SRE as a critical set of skills and a hireable role rose to 15% of the respondents. And I expect this year, particularly given all of the events of this year, that we're going to see that rise go even faster. LinkedIn reports that the role of the site reliability engineer is the 5th fastest growing role for 2020. So aside from it being a service management framework, SRE is also creating a new job role. A job role that hiring managers are starting to understand and to budget for, a role that has significant impact on the organization, and recently over 10,000 jobs in the US, most paying over $100,000. So if you're a systems administrator, software engineer, operations professional, level 2, level 3 support, any of those roles, release manager, SRE is a job to look at, right? There are some really tangible skills that you could bring, but as far as future career growth, it is one to pay attention to. So who should consider learning more about SRE? DevOps Institute has accredited a SRE Foundation certification, and like foundation certifications, the intent is to provide a common understanding of the practices, the principles, the vocabulary, the automation, and the relationship with other frameworks as well. We don't do any training, so our partners at Learning Tree International deliver training against the SRE Foundation certification. Who should learn about it? Everyone. If you're in IT, reliability is something that has to be the goal of everyone. And again, the service only delivers value when it's in production, right? When it's being operated. So everything that comes before and everything that comes after deployment is a part of SRE. The other thing I would encourage you is that if you're coming from traditional ITSM, a lot of interaction happens when people of the same organization participate in a class like this. Because not only do you learn from the instructor, but you talk to each other and you solve problems and you talk about how you do change management today and how SRE advocates it, for example. So again, I would highly encourage, if you're curious about SRE, this is a great course and a great certification to get. So with that, I think it's Amanda who's going to tell us a little bit more about some next steps.
Yes, thanks very much, Jane. The presentation was excellent, but before we move into the Q&A, I do want to point out that Learning Tree has introduced several courses that are related to this SRE topic, which you can see on your screen now, as well as specifically course 3694, which is the SRE Foundation course from DevOps Institute. You can join this course if you're just interested in the topic, as well as for certification purposes. So if you visit us on our website, you can see that information there, and customer service is happy to chat with you. We do have several questions, Jane, that have come up in the chat pod. So to start, we're interested in how to organize around SREs in a large organization.
Well, the good news about that is that Google is a large organization. So a lot of the advice, and you may not be Google, right? And that's okay, because you can adapt, I think, these practices to any size organization. But the original intent of site reliability engineering and bringing the guidance forward was to be able to scale. And so what a lot of organizations did, particularly large organizations that had started to break up into product teams, is to start to look at how do we engage a site reliability engineering team or teams or roles into these product teams so that they were there kind of from the beginning. Now, the ratio of SREs to, say, developers or to other roles is not necessarily one-to-one, right? So you don't necessarily have an SRE for every team, every Scrum team. Some organizations do, but many organizations are finding out that that's difficult. So they start to set up SRE teams that maybe work with different aspects of the same product, different teams within the same product or service. And remember, when I say product, a product is great, but a user, a customer uses service. So there may be multiple products that make up the same service, and one SRE team could perhaps align with them. It could be multiple product teams that are associated with a single product, and then that rolls up to a service. But you might just want an experiment. I think current roles like level 2, level 3 support, systems administrators, application support folks are really primed to potentially become your first SREs. They need some education, right? They may need, say, Python, or they may need some other skills, but I think it's great to start an experiment that way.
Great. So in addition, Jane, how does the SRE role cater to or account for segregation of duties?
So I'm not quite sure what the intent is on segregation of duties. The SRE role is a really interesting role because in many ways it's a generalist, right? It's the ultimate engineering generalist. So needs to know a lot about a lot of different things. And so kind of is the glue in many ways that ties together development and continuous integration, continuous delivery, that of course always has an eye on operations. So can report back to those teams in terms of how things are going or provide tools to do that, but always, again, is looking at the experience. And of course, we use the term reliability, but it is really the quality of the service. So I don't think that SREs in particular, and if you talk to anyone that has taken on that role, particularly in a new organization, they are the ultimate technical generalists, but they also bring a big cultural shift. So they're change agents in many ways, but I don't think if it starts to become siloed, then I think the organization is heading in the wrong direction here.
Thanks. So in your experience, do you see that at some point the SRE role will completely take over the traditional ITSM?
I think that depends. I said in the beginning I wouldn't do a comparison to ITIL. I think ITIL is a governance model, right? It's very still, while there's been a lot of progress in ITIL 4, it still is more heavyweight. Right? I do think that when we look at ITSM as just something we do, as opposed to, kind of a separate group, a separate team, a separate everything, when it just becomes embedded in everything we do, and I think SRE has the ability to do that, then I do think we would kind of call out a little bit of less ITSM and a little bit more of SRE, because it is that third piece of the puzzle. Now that doesn't mean, and I'll kind of proactively address what I'm sure is a question from everybody, do you throw out everything you've ever done with ITIL? And the answer is no, right? No. ITIL has some really good guidance. Your organization should not be loyal to one framework or another. None of them are perfect. Right? There's no such thing as a perfect framework. I don't care whether it's Scaled Agile, Scrum, ITIL, DevOps, or SRE. So what you want to do is you really want to kind of look at what makes most sense for your organization. Honor the past, right? But don't be bound by it, right? So if you've had a change advisory board forever, and you're finding that you have teams that are doing more DevOps and Agile, you might want to start experimenting with an error budget, right? And only save kind of big enterprise impact changes for your CAP. So there's lots of things you can do, but at the end of the day, my hope for ITSM is it doesn't become its own thing. It becomes part of everything. And it's just, here's how we manage incidents, here's how we manage capacity, and we don't need to call it out as something unique.
All right. In your experience, have you seen multiple SRE deployment models, such as a separate SRE squad with their own product owners and scrum masters, etc., or the SREs embedded into the software engineering scrum teams?
I've heard of a little bit of both. Again, what we don't want is SRE office, right? What we don't want is something that becomes another silo. I think SRE teams, could embed members of the team in different product teams or different scrum teams. I think, as I said before, there could be multiple SRE teams that support or engage with multiple product teams or multiple services, depending on what makes logically good sense. You could try just, instead of having a team, designating a few people to be SREs and embed them in a cross-functional, we call them hybrid teams, before you start designating SRE teams. So you could start small, right? Have a few people that you either hire or you groom to be SREs and see, what you learn from that. So there isn't a single model that makes sense. Again, in a large organization, what often happens is an experiment. So maybe it's one service or one product or something along those lines where they experiment with creating an SRE team, and see if that, how that works. Other organizations may just, again, embed some roles. But remember, it's a real job. Right? So it is a well-defined job. I think some enterprises are trying to morph the definition, but it is a job with a job description and a set of responsibilities. So however that's, makes sense for your organization, give it a try.
Okay, to that point, can SRA duties fall under the umbrella of the Service Optimization Department?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. Again, as long as you're staying away from a silo, because nobody likes a silo, right? Where you have to go request, SRE support from, from an office or a department or, something like that. It's not like the PMO. It is much more organic than that, but SRE teams, right? SRE teams that have their focus on capacity, on incident management, on problem management, but also engage with the others makes some sense. So if that service optimization team, right, does then engage and is welcomed by the developers or the automation architects, the release engineers, then that would make a lot of sense from a reporting and an accountability perspective.
All right, and again, similarly, we have an attendee who is a service operations executive with AT&T, so big company, and they think that this SRE role, as you describe it, seems very similar to what they do in service operations.
So again, I don't know what that role does, but yes, this is, if you go way, way back to early days of ITIL, when we had service operations as a single set of competencies, these are primarily the processes that you would focus on from a service operations perspective, right? So it would be incident capacity, change, service level objectives, right? It would be looking at events and observability, because that's how you know your operations are well, right? Now, under that, and again, I don't know what the role is, but under that service operations, would I start to groom maybe a little bit more of the ability for autonomy, right? So maybe looking at how does this team engage with others, so that, again, there's involvement before production. Most importantly, I think that if there's an incident or something comes up, these are technical teams. These are teams that are able to optimize automation. They're able to engineer their way out of manual toil. They're able to create, new kind of observability or event tools. that are associated with it. So I said, I apologize, I don't know what the specifics of the role is, but yes, this takes away, from a service management perspective, it takes away the strategy and the design piece of it in its traditional form, but engages on the strategy on design with resources like the development team. And maybe you don't do your own development. There's that possibility too. But you certainly would engage with the pre-production teams as well.
Okay, so could you mute, Jane?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So how does this integrate with an existing DevOps project team or an Agile team? Is SRE already represented there, or is it in addition to or a hybrid of those?
That's a great question, really. That's a fantastic question. So interestingly enough, there are many who think that SRE is a part of DevOps. And the great part is it's kind of the next step. You know, if you think of IT as a system, really, we have three kind of parts of the system. We have the development part of the system. You may call it agile, right? We have the preparation or the deployment or the release part of the system, which is build, test, deploy, which is mostly what most people define DevOps as, right? And then you have what happens after the release and the operations side, which is really SRE. So DevOps and SRE are not the same thing. They didn't actually, one was not a byproduct of the other. SRE didn't grow up out of DevOps. They kind of grew up in parallel, although SRE I think is even moving faster than DevOps originally did. So the great thing is they operated in parallel, but they're aligned, right? They're aligned. And so if you're a service owner in DevOps, if you're involved in continuous delivery or continuous deployment or continuous testing, you want the operational perspective, but you also want somebody who's thinking about engineering, right? Somebody who could look at your architecture and understand what that's going to look like in production and can start making the preparatory steps for it. You want somebody who can report back from the operational battlefield, right, to make sure that that they're there. So there's a really, really close alignment between DevOps and SRE, but they were not one was not again a product of the other, which is great because you get different perspectives, right? You get the developer's perspective, you get the infrastructure, build, test, deploy, test, you know, again, continuous testing, continuous deployment. And then you get the operational perspective, which truthfully I think was missing from DevOps from its earliest days.
Thanks. If we move into an SRE role in the company, do we still need a change advisory board to go along with that?
That's really a great question, and I think there's a lot of debate. I personally think that a CAB still has a role, but a very, very, very high level role. So if your organization is the type of organization that is putting in a request for change for every single change 2 weeks in advance or 2 days in advance or whatever, you don't need the CAB to look at that. Right? You know, looking at error budgets or other means of going faster is there. If you want to keep your change advisory board for really the big impact releases, then that makes some sense. The only problem with the change advisory board, which I think has been a lot of the pushback, is that most of the people on the CAB are so far away from the actual change that their ability to assess it may be limited. Now, they may look at it from a business perspective, that's important, right? They may look at it from other changes that are happening, that's important. But what happened with the CAB is it became a one-size-fits-all, and so everyone had to put in a request for change, and everyone had to fill out forms, and everyone had to wait for the CAB to deem it okay, and that actually became a delay. So I do think that if an organization wants a CAB for more of an enterprise level release, that makes sense. But for the type of releases we're talking about here, which you would just call bigger approach to standard changes, I don't think you need a CAB for that. I think, oh, Amanda, you want me to mute? I'm sorry.
That's all right. I think we have time for one more question. How does an SRE help manage services in highly integrated systems?
I mean, truthfully, again, in a highly integrated system structure, the nice thing is that the ability to, I think, anyhow, again, I don't know the environment, the ability to kind of see the service as opposed to looking at it from a product perspective or even looking at it from a component perspective is greater because the service is built on highly integrated architectures. So also the opportunity to understand reliability of the service is greater, right? Whereas organizations that are perhaps working from a product management perspective, where one product maybe is part of multiple, but it is looked at it from a singular perspective. I think that makes it harder. The other point is when we look at the movement towards microservices, where we're starting to decouple these applications, these architectures into the sum of their microservices, I think SREs are perfectly suited for managing that because we can look at services at a much more discrete level.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Jane, we very much appreciate your time and expertise today for this webinar session, and to all the attendees, thank you for joining us. As I said earlier, this presentation will be available in your My Learning Tree account in the next couple of weeks. Maybe allow some extra time with the holiday break. But if you do have any questions about SRE or about Learning Tree programs, please feel free to contact us. We're happy to talk with you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Happy New Year. Stay safe. Thank you, Learning Tree. Really appreciate the opportunity.